Now let's go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our moderator and then, of course, our esteemed speaker before he gives us some remarks. Moderating the discussion is Dr. Craig Calhoun, a professor of social sciences at ASU and the interim director of the Malikian Center. Professor Calhoun is also a professor at the London School of Economics. So Professor, thanks for being with us. For those of you that don't know, Professor Calhoun's newest book, The Degenerations of Democracy, will be published hopefully in April or May technically, but hopefully I'll get a copy before that, Professor. I can't wait to read it and look forward to hopefully hosting it at PCFR when the time comes as well. And then now on to our really impressive and exciting speaker, Dennis Kwok. Thanks for being with us. Dennis is the senior fellow at the Ash Center at Harvard University and is a founding member of the Civic Party in Hong Kong. The Civic Party was founded in 2006 and was one of the key political parties in Hong Kong that championed the protection of the rule of law, of democracy, and of human rights. Dennis, you spoke to us in person before. Grateful for you to join us again. Thank you for being here. Dennis, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me again. It is an honor and a privilege to speak at the PCFR. And as Luke said, I've come to Phoenix before and met you in person, some of you, and that was in 2018. I was still a lawmaker back then, and no one could have predicted how fast and how fierce the change that came to Hong Kong and the region, and in general, China, and how that has changed the geopolitical landscape of things. I always say that Hong Kong and Xinjiang are possibly the two incidents that changed the narrative on how people look at China. Hong Kong, in Hong Kong's case, people understand that China has promised in an international treaty known as the Sino-British Joint Declaration, signed in 1984, that it would preserve Hong Kong's freedom and give Hong Kong people a high degree of autonomy in regulating and governing their own affairs. And this is guaranteed in the treaty and was put into our constitution known as the Basic Law. And it is something that we Hong Kong people have tried very hard, especially the Democrats, including myself, to hold the system together and to try to get Beijing to honor the word and spirit of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and also the promise that they would give universal suffrage democracy to the Hong Kong people. And I remember back in 2018, I was already saying that things are beginning to be very difficult and very uncomfortable. But that was just the very, very beginning. What happened in 2019 in Hong Kong, just to recap for some of you, is that the Hong Kong government tried to introduce a legislation that would allow Hong Kong people to be extradited to China to face criminal trial. And that touched on a very raw nerve of the Hong Kong people, because the reason why we have one country, two systems is because the Hong Kong people didn't trust the mainland system, especially the legal system, and the lack of the rule of law and respect for human rights. And the idea or the prospect that Hong Kong people would be sent to China to face criminal trials is something which one country, two system was precisely designed to prevent. And the Hong Kong people came out in millions and protest against it, and that the tension rose to a level which was never seen in Hong Kong before. And 2019 saw a year of protests and changes and people demanding to be heard. And the Hong Kong government, backed by Beijing, simply clamped down on those protests and refused to accede to the demands of the people. And the nail in the coffin is when they introduced the national security law directly from Beijing, a direct promulgation of a law that is draconian, vague, and broad at the same time, which has successfully and totally changed Hong Kong society since its promulgation in June 2020. Within a year and a half, we've seen the complete destruction of opposition politicians. A lot of my colleagues, as we speak, are now in jail in Hong Kong and are looking at very long jail sentences for simply doing things like participating in a primary democratic election to decide who should be running in the general election. And that in other normal competitive democratic societies is basically part of the game. But in Hong Kong, that is considered as subversion by the authorities. And simply holding up a slogan which says that we want to liberate Hong Kong and restore freedom could land you in jail for many years. And also attending an unauthorized peaceful assembly could land you in jail for up to a year, if not more. So within a year, all my colleagues, all the opposition leaders are in jail. They've destroyed independent media by locking up and arresting the senior management, journalists and editors and radio hosts. A lot of people like myself have emigrated abroad because it is simply impossible for us to consider continuing our work to fight for democracy, rule of law, and freedom. In November 2020, I was disqualified as a lawmaker directly by the National People's Congress Standing Committee on the grounds that I have allegedly breached my oath of office. But this is a small thing in the grand scheme of things, judging on what they have done to Hong Kong as a whole. So this is the context which begins our discussion today, which is about Taiwan and Taiwan Strait relations. The reason why I want to raise this as a topic is when I was a lawmaker, I frequently tell my friends in the international community that you should care about Hong Kong because after the fall of Hong Kong, the next issue that you'll be looking at landing on your desk is Taiwan. And this is becoming more real and more true as we speak. A few months ago, China flew 150 warplanes into the air defense zone of Taiwan. And this is the highest number ever that we've seen in terms of military posturing or military threat that has been made by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And the rhetoric that you are seeing on both sides from the PRC and the Republic of China and Taiwan, the leaders on both sides are upping the rhetoric. And so is the President of the United States. Now, because of what happened to Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020, the Taiwanese people are now saying very clearly that they will not reunite with China under the formula of one country, two systems. Now, you see, historically, the peace or stability of the Taiwan Strait have been able to be maintained through several pieces of puzzle or policies. On the one hand, you have what is known as the 1992 consensus that was reached between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. That basically said that, look, we're not going to be able to resolve our differences over the remnants left over by the civil war in China in the 1940s. But let's agree that we should continue to talk, that we should have commerce, we should have cross-border transportation, and a cultural exchange of some sort between our two people. So let's come to a consensus to agree that there should be only one China, but different interpretations. So the People's Republic of China would say it is the PRC, but we will not discuss or debate about which China it should be. And likewise, the Taiwanese government agreed that there should be one China, but different interpretations. So that kind of fudge over what is one China and which China has enabled people to avoid a very difficult and painful discussion about which China is the proper China. And also, the United States has deliberately adopted the policy of strategic ambiguity over the question of Taiwan Strait, saying that on one hand, look, we recognize there's only one China, and we will establish diplomatic relationship with the PRC. But at the same time, the Taiwan Relations Act was there to enacted to ensure that PRC aggression will not become reality, and that there is this check and balance, if I may, that the United States may be engaged if PRC is to invade Taiwan. And also, Deng Xiaoping came up with the idea of one country, two system in the 1980s to primarily deal with not so much Hong Kong, but Taiwan, because the one country, two system idea was designed as a way to for reunification with between Taiwan and China. And it was, Hong Kong was sort of used like a guinea pig or a testing ground to say, look, we know that you operate under a different system, a free democratic system with the rule of law, very different from our system, but let's have one country, but two different systems in which we could coexist, so to speak. But what's happened in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020 has left no room for any maneuver or ambiguity, in the sense that the Taiwanese people are now clearly and openly saying, by electing President Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP to presidential office, and likely in the future, in the next term as well, another DPP presidential candidate, they are saying loudly and clearly to Beijing, we don't want to reunify with you under one country, two system, because we don't want to be Hong Kong. Tsai Ing-wen's, President Tsai's election slogan in 2019 was, if you want Hong Kong to become tomorrow's Taiwan, then you vote KMT. And that worked really well. And all her election campaign were playing videos of students being beaten down by police and what have you, and all the oppression scenes in Hong Kong basically sealed the deal for the Taiwanese people. And KMT, the Kuomintang, basically cannot come up with a coherent position on the central issue, which is on every Taiwanese mind, which is its relationship with China. In the past, they could fudge and say that maybe we can consider one country, two system. Let's not spoil the party. Let's continue to talk, or to continue to see whether one country, two systems in Hong Kong is working. And for the first 10, 15 years, they were able to say, hey, it's kind of working. Hong Kong is prospering under one country, two system, et cetera, et cetera. But 2019 has put a complete end to it. But also now thrown into the mix is the new leader, well, not so new now, under Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping is the game changer. He has not only transformed domestic Chinese politics, he has basically changed China's policy towards Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Xinjiang, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and also its foreign policy. Now, what happened to Hong Kong is not in isolation. It is part of a bigger puzzle of where the rest of the country is going. Its aggression towards Hong Kong in changing and basically walking back on the Sino-British Joint Declaration, a UN-registered treaty, and also its oppression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and the threats it is making to Taiwan, and also its militarization of the South China Sea, together with a very aggressive and assertive foreign policy towards countries like Europe, in Europe, in Australia, the trade war and sanctions against Australia, and of course with the United States. This is all part of a major structural change in the direction of where China is going. And on the question of Taiwan, President Xi Jinping has said very clearly in many occasions that he said that the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization, which is the big theme for him, cannot come about without the reunification of Taiwan. So he has conflated the issue of the reunification with Taiwan to equate that with the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization. So in other words, he's saying, we are strong now. We are a great nation. We are prosperous. You have a strong leader. And the most important piece of the puzzle now is to seek for reunification with Taiwan, either through peaceful means or else. And the offer he puts on the table, it is one country, two system. And patience is running out. And he's saying that we cannot leave the question of Taiwan to the next generation. And this is the offer that we're putting on the table. One country, by the way, means the People's Republic of China. There's no longer room for fudge about that question. And if you reunify with us, it will be under the banner of the 5-star flag, and it will be under the name of the People's Republic of China. Now, Xi Jinping has changed the rhetoric in that sense. And the Taiwanese people, on the other hand, they look at Hong Kong and say, no way we're accepting a deal. And especially the younger Taiwanese people, if you go talk to them, they actually have very little connection or even emotional sentiment about China. China is a foreign country. For them, they've always grown up in a free, liberal, democratic country known as Taiwan. And for them, they don't really feel the need or the emotional sentiment that was may have existed in the past for the older generation people about this China concept. For them, Taiwan is their country. They love it. They love the way of life. And if you speak to them, they actually have very little connection with Taiwan. And these people, the sentiment, the younger generation sentiments growing in Taiwan. And when Xi Jinping sent 150 warplanes to Taiwan, making it very clear that a military option is one that they would seriously consider, then the American government is then in a situation where they have to decide whether the strategic ambiguity, the policy of strategic ambiguity, basically saying to both sides, back off, we will not engage unless you do not engage with one another in a hostile military fashion, then we will also back off. But this policy, as I've argued on many occasions, I think this era has come to an end, whether we like it or not. The area of strategic ambiguity is no longer workable as a solution to maintain peace over the Taiwan Strait. Our friends in Japan and our friends in Australia are now changing a conversation completely in the sense that we have a situation where if Taiwan is forcibly taken over by China, by the PLA, it will directly upset and change the national security interests of countries like Japan and Australia. And the politicians and leaders in those two countries are completely waking up to that fact. Japan is now openly talking about defending Taiwan, and so is Australia, because it is in their interest of doing so. They know that if the PLA or the CCP takes over Taiwan, it would be like giving China an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Indo-Pacific that could project power all the way out to the West and Southern Pacific, directly affecting the security interests of Japan and Australia. And Japan and Australia is crying out for US involvement. And a lot of people ask me, well, will the US be involved if China invades Taiwan? The question is, and the fact is, US is already in the region. You have troops in Guam, you have troops in Philippines, in Japan, in South Korea, and you have security pact with Australia in the new AUKUS security pact. And your allies basically need US presence to maintain the security balance of the Indo-Pacific. So if China invades Taiwan or does use military forces in some kind of form, US is already involved, whether you like it or not, because Taiwan is too important a subject for the US and the international community to ignore. Because if Taiwan is to be taken over, the South China Sea will also be at risk of being completely militarized by the People's Republic of China. And why is the South China Sea important? 60% of international cargo goes through the South China Sea. The internet depends on undersea internet cables that go through the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Without those undersea cables, we wouldn't be doing this seminar. The internet won't work. And this is exactly how important the South China Sea and the issue of Taiwan is to the international community. And the situation is becoming to a point where that China or under Xi Jinping, they have to do something about the Taiwan issue at some point. Now, people ask me, why is Xi Jinping so anxious to do something about the Taiwanese question? I want to explain to you that all politics are local, and there are domestic political reasons. What Xi Jinping wants is to be the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. He has, to a certain degree, achieved that, but he has not completely achieved that goal. What he wants, in basic terms, is he wants his portrait up there on Tiananmen Square alongside Mao Zedong. He wants his face to be printed on every $100 bill. And he wants to be lifetime president. He wants to rule until he passes away. In order to do that, he needs a political legacy. And right now, he doesn't have that political legacy. Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China. Deng Xiaoping made it rich and prosperous through the open and reform policy. And to date, Xi Jinping has no such legacy that he could claim his name to, put his hat on, to say that I'm as great as the previous leader like Deng and Mao because I've done something great. And that's something great in a lot of the psyche and minds of the Chinese political elites and amongst a lot of Chinese people is the reunification of the country that has been split by the civil war and has been a frozen conflict for decades, but is still there. And in the minds of the Chinese people and the minds of the Chinese leadership, taking over Taiwan is as natural and as entitled an asset or price that whoever achieved it will be gaining a legacy, a political legacy for himself that could be used to the greatest benefit of that person. And that person, of course, is Xi Jinping. And he wants to claim that political legacy. Will something happen within a short time? In my prediction, no. Because from now until November, the most important thing on the political agenda for him and for the party is for him to secure a third term in the November party congress that is going to happen later this year. From now until then, I think it will be too much risk for him to do something about Taiwan. And there's no need to at the moment, because he needs to secure that third term first, and also to deal with COVID and also the many of the economic issues that is facing domestic economy in China. But after that, things will become very tricky. We will have another presidential election in 2023 and 2024. As I predict, I think the DPP will win another landslide victory over the KMT, who is increasingly marginalized because they cannot come up with a coherent position on the issue with its relations with China. And the voters are increasingly disappointed with the KMT. And if the DPP wins another term and Xi Jinping gains his third term in November, then everything will have to come to a head at some point within the next 2, 3, maximum 5 years, because Xi Jinping cannot afford to say all this rhetoric about Taiwan, claim all this power that he has consolidated, and do nothing over the issue of Taiwan. He has to do something over the issue of Taiwan. And right now, I bet he's watching Ukraine very closely. He's looking at the Western allies and the United States to see if they have the guts and the unity to stand up to Russian aggression. And if they don't, and if they see that there's any sign of weakness, it will just add to the risk calculation that Xi Jinping has and will be doing when they consider whether to make a move on Taiwan to test the resolve of the Western allies. Now, one last point I want to make is between a full-scale invasion, when people talk about, oh, invading Taiwan, they already have in mind, which is like a Normandy type full-scale amphibious invasion. But I just want to take a step back from that. Between doing nothing and a full-scale invasion, there are many, many options which China could take against Taiwan. Some of them may be a physical blockade. China now has the largest naval fleet in the world with 355 warships. It could engage in a physical blockade of Taiwan. It could engage in cybersecurity by cutting off Taiwan's internet access to the rest of the world. It could invade the outlying islands of Matsu and to take over those islands, and it will be seen as an act of military aggression by the Taiwanese government, forcing them to act. So there are many different options which China could do, very much akin to what Putin is doing by putting 100,000 troops along the border of Ukraine as a way to leverage, as a way to negotiate. So what we're saying is that everything is coming to a head, and that we are better off by understanding the tension that exists that basically forces Xi Jinping to do something. The most powerful political ideology right now in China is nationalism, aggressive nationalism. And there are many different instances of that I could point to, that the nationalism is really driving policies in ways we haven't seen a country to do so since the 1930s. The highest grossing film last year in China was a movie called The Battle of Changjin Lake, which is a movie about the Korean War. It talks about the volunteers who went to the Korean War to fight against the Americans. And in the movie, the most famous dialogue is one soldier turning to the next saying, how many Americans do I have to kill in order to be a hero? 2. And the other guy said, you better add a 0 to that before considering yourself a hero. And that movie is a distortion of many historical facts, and it's a complete, utter propaganda. But that is what the Chinese people are watching, and this is what the Chinese government wants its people to be watching. And this is a very dangerous force which they're unleashing. Before I finish, I see that Secretary Barrett, you're here, and it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining. It's really an honor to see you again. So I'm happy to take any questions. Professor, I know you're an expert in this subject, and I'm happy to take any questions, or if there are issues that you want me to clarify, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Those were extraordinarily rich remarks, and somewhat sadly, I think, completely on target and very apt for our moment. You say I'm an expert on this subject. I want to begin by saying the subject is really multiple subjects. Your talk could have been entitled, Everything is Connected. And I want to pull out 3 themes from that to ask some questions about, and then of course go to the larger participating group for their questions and comments in this. This is partly about Hong Kong. I'll ask a first question about that in a minute, but you have quickly made it clear it's Hong Kong in relation to Taiwan, in relation to what's happening in China, in relation to Xinjiang, in relation to a larger question about China. But then it's equally geopolitics. It's China in the world, and it's other questions like, to what extent is there a direct analogy in Russia's dealings with the Ukraine and China's dealings with Hong Kong. So I think we have to do justice to the issues and to your talk about all three. Let me begin, though, very locally. You said, indeed, all politics is local, but interestingly, you then referred to Chinese politics. But Hong Kong politics has very local dimensions too. So I want to just ask you a little bit first about that. And first, quite bluntly, how defeated do you think the Hong Kong struggle for some level of democratic autonomy is, and how much it stays alive? There are various efforts to stage protests, to comment, to hold vigils and things. The vigil movement of a couple of years ago came to an end. Today we saw the release of Edward Leung, the leader of indigenous Hong Kong. So let me focus this in a question. It seemed to me that the internal story of Hong Kong, like that of Taiwan and of other places, involved people shifting their identities from people who happened to live somewhere to people who felt strongly that they were citizens, that they belonged there, that there was citizenship. And in the Hong Kong case, there was protest politics, often from younger people, and there was a politics of institutions trying to maintain their independence. Press institutions, universities, legal institutions that you yourself have been a part of. Where do you see the state of play right now? Could Leung be released because fundamentally China faces no serious challenge in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think you have summarized it very well, Professor, as to what has kept Hong Kong free over all these years. It is the institutions like the Legislative Council, like the courts, like the press, the media, and students and young people like Edward Leung, who were able to advocate for their political ideals in an environment that is based on the rule of law. But all that is completely gone. Since the promulgation of the national security law, more than 50 civil society groups are forced to close or left Hong Kong. For example, Amnesty International issued a statement saying that they can no longer operate in Hong Kong because they can no longer guarantee the safety of its staff. A lot of NGOs, international NGOs, are coming to me for advice on whether they could continue their operation in Hong Kong, given all the new laws that are coming in that could prosecute people. And holding a candle in the middle of Victoria Park on the 4th of June to commemorate the Tiananmen massacre used to be a symbol of Hong Kong's freedom, and that has been completely snuffed out. Edward Leung has been released from prison, but I think he's walking into a giant prison, which is Hong Kong. He has closed his Facebook page. He has said he will not take any media interviews. He will not speak out publicly about any political issues because he knows the moment he does that, he will be arrested by the National Security Police. A lot of our friends like Martin Lee, whom some of you know, are now completely silenced. So is Anson Chan, our very dear friend, my mentor, is completely silent. She cannot afford to come out and say anything, and she has completely withdrawn from public life. And this is a very personal and painful moment for a lot of Hong Kong people. And I'm fortunate enough to be having this platform and this opportunity to speak freely. I felt digress a little bit. You don't know how precious your freedom is until it's taken away. And for someone like me, I always enjoy intellectual discussion of this kind, where we could free and engage in issues, in a free way. But in Hong Kong, if I'm in Hong Kong, we cannot have this discussion. I'll be arrested tomorrow, because I've made comments like Taiwan is in fact a independent sovereign country. But to make a statement like that, you are risking arrest and prosecution. But that's the fact. A fact that people cannot ignore. But if you say something like that, then you will draw the ire of the authoritarian government in Hong Kong. So just to come back to your comment, Professor, that Hong Kong is different from Taiwan in many ways. I'm not saying that Taiwan and Hong Kong are somehow in parallel. Hong Kong is a cakewalk for the CCP at the end of the day. It is a cakewalk for them to take over Hong Kong, to crush it, because they have an army there. They can do whatever it wants. The question I have is, why did the international community believe that an authoritarian government like the CCP would honor its words in the Sino-British Joint Declaration to guarantee Hong Kong people's freedom? Now, I hope the international community won't be so naive when we go talk to the Chinese, when they say they will honor this and honor that, or commit to climate change, etc. I would use President Ronald Reagan's famous phrase, trust but verify. The fact that they are making all these promises means that you've got to really think about what happened to Hong Kong, and the fact that they could just walk back on promises in international treaty. And that's the China that you're dealing with.
So I'm not going to follow up on the general problem, which I think is a real problem, of the sort of dance between declarations of intent and treaties and on the other hand, material interests and pressures that structures so much of diplomacy. But let me go straight to Taiwan, because I think you make good points about this. One of the differences, it seems to me, between the Hong Kong situation and Taiwan, there are many, as you rightly say, is that China was able to exert much more control over the business community of Hong Kong than it is over the business community of Taiwan. And business ceased to be a counterbalance. For a long time, business and market considerations gave an incentive for Hong Kong independence to China. And for various reasons, the development of China economically took away some of its sense of needing that incentive. And at the same time, Hong Kong businesses chose to be very tightly integrated with their PRC counterparts. And often they were the same business. They were overlapping in many ways. Is that fair to say that one of the institutions that once bolstered independence that doesn't is the business community?
You have the point precisely, Professor. 20 years ago, China needed Wall Street. Now, Wall Street needed China. You see that 20 years ago, China needed the JP Morgan, the Morgan Stanley, the Goldman Sachs to be in China, the HSBC, to use Hong Kong as a base to attract more than 60% of the foreign direct capital investment are through Hong Kong, through the financial institutions based there because of the rule of law, etc. But 20 years on, as China become massively prosperous, at least some people are there, they have made a calculation, which I think they have succeeded, to say that if we do this to Hong Kong, yes, the international community will issue statement, they will condemn this, condemn that, but at the end of the day, the banks, the Western businesses, they will stay where they are because there's money to be made. And if you look at what Jamie Dimon and Ray Dalio and all the big financial firms and management saying, look, we see there's money to be made. China is opening its financial markets. The tables are now turned. We actually need to go in there. So yeah, very bad, very sad about what happened in Hong Kong, but international businesses, including banks like HSBC, has actually issued a statement in support. Its CEO issued a statement in support of the national security law. But I'm not surprised, because having dealt with these business people over the course of my career as a lawmaker, I know exactly how they think. They don't really care about the Sino-British Joint Declaration, let alone democracy. They care about whether there's money to be made. And the structure of Hong Kong's financial markets have changed over the years as well. The largest listed companies and financial institutions in Hong Kong are all red capital, what we call PRC companies and PRC banks and PRC money. So they've made the calculation, which I think, as I said, they've succeeded in saying that we could do this to Hong Kong, you guys are not going to pull out. And I think they're right for now.
So one of the issues in the world that we've lived with varying degrees of success for a long time is the notion that there's a reliable distinction between the inside and the outside of countries, and that we can talk about sovereignty and say there's domestic affairs and there's international affairs and so forth. So part of the story here is China saying Hong Kong and indeed Taiwan are China. They're not someplace else. Saying that Xinjiang is integrally part of China, that Tibet is, that therefore other countries are violating China's sovereignty if they object. So, and not just other countries, but businesses. The condition of being a neutral market actor is interpreted to be, don't criticize human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Don't raise these issues. So I see, a more general issue around the extent to which it's debatable, and debatable lots of places, what counts as inside and outside. And here it seems to me is this crucial analogy to Ukraine, which you rightly bring up. In Hong Kong, to some extent, in Taiwan, to a very large extent, there's a population declaring a distinct identity. Taiwanese, not just Chinese, not the same Chinese. And there's a country, PRC, saying, no, you're just Chinese. And in many ways, the Ukraine struggle reflects a similar issue, with Russia saying that Ukraine is fundamentally Russian, a birthplace of Russia, in fact, and making arguments. The language is not really distinct. I won't go into the whole set of arguments about dialects and all that in China, but basically insisting that the project of dealing with Ukraine is not foreign affairs, but domestic affairs. And therefore that international actors, diplomatic or otherwise, confront a fundamental limit to that. So I think we're in agreement about that, but let me ask if that's your understanding as well.
When Hitler took over the Sudetenland, he made the same argument, saying that, look, it's German. We're dealing with German land and German people who wants to be reunified with the mother nation. And China is making the same argument about Taiwan, that it is part of China, and we're just bringing it back into the fold, and really it's none of anyone else's business. But I, for a start, don't buy into any of that logic that this is simply a Chinese affair. The Taiwanese people feel very differently about it. The Taiwanese people, the majority of them, 90% of them, reject any sort of deal with China over one country, two system. And also, it is a democratic, a free society, very different from China. Is the world really going to sit idly by to see an authoritarian regime take over Taiwan, which is a free democratic country? And there are also the real politique issues that I mentioned earlier about US interest in the Indo-Pacific, and our allies in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan and Australia, rely on American presence to maintain the peace. And what Xi Jinping is doing is, you could use the analogy that he's doing his own version of the Monroe Doctrine. He wants to push American interests out of Indo-Pacific. And in order to do that, he needs to take Taiwan. And so it is not an internal affair of China. Hong Kong is not an internal affair of China. There is an international treaty at stake that supports what was supposed to be Hong Kong's governing system. So, I mean, I just don't buy China rhetoric about this. I mean, when they imposed trade sanctions on Australia, they could call that internal politics too, because how dare Australia call for investigation of COVID-19? That's what happened in Wuhan, and that's really our internal affairs. But is it really? When 3 million people die, shouldn't we find out what happened there? So I mean, in this day and age, I mean, I just don't see the logic of this.
I agree with you on almost all the particulars, but what I want to keep pointing out is how contested this is. It seems to me not obvious what the international community will stand by and allow. but a real question. And this question of how well treaties work and whether they're respected and whether words count, where we began by noting that the Chinese declarations of 1997 turn out to be pretty hollow, comes up again with lots of other treaties and declarations and things. So there's a continual sort of negotiation and either a reaffirmation, yes, we meant what we said, or a willingness to redefine that goes on in all of this. Quickly, before we open up to the audience, I want to just note how much this is embedded in geopolitics. And I think what Dennis has said is absolutely right, but that is, it's not just China being more and more assertive. It is a larger global situation in which there are questions about the extent to which the United States has comparable hegemonic power to what it exercised before. Europe seems to be a very weak foreign policy actor, although a big economic trading partner and so forth. And part of the story of the Ukraine is Europe can't develop a foreign policy. Why not? Well, to oversimplify, because Germany is dependent on Russian gas, having moved aggressively against nuclear power. The Nord Stream pipeline is in place. Infrastructure, right? An example of the Chinese policy of financing infrastructural development all across China, which makes all across Asia and the world, in fact, which makes the question of US response not only the military question, but precisely the question of what does this mean for global interconnection? And can the US generate an alternative project of global interconnection? It's trying to rival in various ways the Chinese projection across Asia. But this, then goes to India, where there's not a project of reincorporation of a seemingly lost part, but there is a project of majoritarian nationalism. And all around Asia, all of this contained within a struggle, which I just want to say puts a lot of the light back on decisions about what the US is going to do or not do. So let's open this.
Those are really big questions. And I would, they're huge questions. All I want to say, and then happy to answer more questions, is that what happened in Hong Kong and Xinjiang really challenges the international system that we've relied on for decades. One is international treaty. What happens if a country signs a treaty, registered with the UN, and then walk back on it? Right now, there's no consequences whatsoever that you could do. There's no clawback provision in those treaties, and there's no arbiter. We have convention against genocide. We have convention against crime against humanity. What they're doing to the Uyghurs, from all the evidence that we've been seeing coming out, live witnesses, some pretty horrific things are happening there. But then again, apart from condemning and issuing a few sanctions, what are we really doing to stand up to the values and the things that we say should never happen again in history? But those things are really challenging our understanding of international treaty. And one more example: South China Sea, freedom of navigation. Why do the U.S. and other countries conduct freedom of navigation exercises? Because of the Convention of the Sea, of international freedom of navigation rights. But if China is to militarize the South China Sea, that would have profound impact on not only geopolitical politics, but also on our understanding of international law when it comes to these issues.
So absolutely, this is not just a Hong Kong question, not just a China question, it's a world question. And let's go, though, in thinking about China, to Susan Widener's question that she's brought up in the chat. Susan, do you want to state that orally, or should I summarize? Tina is nodding like I should summarize. The question is, what's the distinctive voice, or is there a distinctive voice, of all of the many Chinese students who've been educated abroad? And I would add all the many Chinese people who have worked abroad for many years during the years of opening, and are very much engaged with the larger world and following it. Is there any ability for them to be resistant to trends in the PRC?
No, the short answer is no. Basically, they have used technology so well in China. Some say they created 1984. I think they've done more than that. It is like there's a Russian, I forgot the name of this Russian novelist who wrote a book in the 1920s saying that a future society where the authoritarian regime controls everything is where everyone lives in glass boxes and you can see what each other is doing all the time. And Professor, you may know the name of that novelist. I forgot. But anyway, I think effectively they have created a society like that, whereby they could see what you're saying to your spouse on a chat box. They could see what you're doing in every single street in the city. I was invited to the Shenzhen police headquarters, where they proudly showed me into a room where they have a TV screen the size of a football field. And on that TV screen, they have 20,000 cameras trained on every single street in that city. And if you jaywalk, for example, they could immediately see who you are by facial recognition. And then they could send a message to your mobile phone, which is registered to the person, to say that you're jaywalking, we're just taking $100 from your bank account and 10 points off your social credit score. It is that kind of society where every day you have to open the Xi Jinping app to read Xi Jinping thoughts for 30 minutes, and you can't stop. You gotta, they track you. I mean, it's that kind of society that you're talking about, and they've done a great job at creating this kind of authoritarian regime. And it's impossible for anyone to speak out or to organize, because if you organize, if say 5 of you get together, your mobile phones will track where your location is, and they would start looking into your message. Hey, why are these 5 guys getting together? You see what I mean? The same thing is happening to Hong Kong. They're using COVID measures, COVID quarantine measures, COVID laws to basically ban people. If you're walking down the street in the wrong part of town, you could be handed a fine or arrested on COVID grounds. I mean, that is how they've done it. And that is reason why I think one of the reasons why they have such stringent COVID measures is in part to control society.
No, I think that's probably true. I know we live in a surveillance world because we have state surveillance of that kind. And I think the novel from the early Soviet Union was We by Zamyatin that you were referring to. But that revealed that in the early years, there were critical voices. He was silenced, in fact, in the Soviet Union. And one of the questions for us remains, will there be critical voices in Chinese, and how? And do they have to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts to be critical voices, or is it totally stifled? Let me turn, though, to a question that Ambassador Hartwig posed at the very beginning, and paraphrasing it as I'd say, how much are leaders in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, in the power structure, monitoring what the US says or does, what the West says or does? How much are their actions with regard to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and so forth, driven by Chinese imperatives that won't be changed by anything that other countries do? Or how do they monitor their global response as a potential issue? And is response to Ukraine a bellwether for that?
That's a great question. The reason why at the beginning of the one country, two system, like for example, after the transfer of the sovereignty in 1997, there was a great need for Chinese to appear to honor the one country, two system agreement, because it wanted to enter into the WTO at the time. And remember, China entered the WTO in 2001. The United States granted China a permanent status, a favorable nation status in 2001. And that is exactly what they want, because they can't at that point in time, they can start behaving whatever the way they want, because they needed the international respectability, that they are trusted, responsible international partners that the rest of the world could deal with, so that they could get into the WTO. But once they got into the WTO, they used the next 10 years to basically got themselves extremely prosperous and rich. And by the time it's 2010, after the Olympics, remember the Beijing Olympics is 2008. And that's when they have to portray this wonderful image of them opening up, that they are really a player in the international stage. Once they've secured that, then we see that start to change in their rhetoric and policies towards Hong Kong. And that was our experience. Slowly but surely, they have start adding things to the basic law to say, but we can control this, but we can control that, but because one country trumps two systems. And then in 2014, they issued with a white paper to say that they control every aspect of life in Hong Kong, which is never mentioned in the basic law. So what happened is that they have grown rich, more powerful and influential on the international stage, to a point where they really don't have to care about the international community so much anymore, because they've gotten what they wanted. And for international community to start protesting about what you're doing to Hong Kong, for them, it really doesn't matter. In fact, it works to their narrative, because the narrative from the very beginning of the protests in 2019 is that it was instigated by foreign forces. It was instigated by people in the United States who wants to instigate unrest in China. And they have to crush that foreign forces that was working in Hong Kong. So, I mean, for them, that's the narrative from the beginning. But that narrative was used to drive domestic politics. So the Chinese people feel like, oh, you know, this is all foreign forces. This is all CIA at work. And therefore, we have to crush it. And the more they complain, the more the international community complains. That is evidence that they are really behind this whole thing.
I feel like a voice of authoritarianism crushing free discussion to say that we're reaching the end of our time in this. We didn't get to go to some really good questions about things like, can sanctions regimes work? Your recent comments suggest you're not very optimistic. And what does this mean for academic exchanges and partnerships? Should ASU and Thunderbird and others be worried in their relations with China? All questions that you've helped us put on the table, Dennis, and I really appreciate it. This has been a great discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much.